Whew. Hello. Today, we'll be looking at starting with some basic shapes, like cubes, cylinders, and the infamous sphere. All you need to shade these is a pencil and a basic knowledge of light and shadow. Light comes from a direction, or a source, and when that light hits an object, it creates a light spot, or a highlight. Any sides of the object that turn or face away from the light will be the shadow, the darker areas. Now, light can also reflect off of the table and create a little light spot in the shadow. This is called reflected light. For centuries, artists have been mastering their ability to draw highlights and shadows using three basic objects: a cylinder, a cube, and a sphere. Almost any shape in the real world can be simplified into one of these three shapes. Therefore, if you learn to shade these, then you can shade anything. Let's see how it's done. The first shape I'll tackle is a cylinder. And to start, I'll create the outline. The top of a cylinder is created with a very skinny oval called an ellipse. Then I'll draw the sides and half of an oval at the bottom. Make sure the bottom of the cylinder has that curved edge to it to make it look 3D. Before we start shading, you have to consider the light source. I'm going to imagine the light source is coming from the top left. Therefore, the shadow is going to be on the right side of the cylinder because that side is hidden from the light. But I'm not going to put the darkest part of the shadow up against the very right side of the cylinder because I want to leave room for a little bit of reflected light to wrap around that back edge. Next, I'll begin to create a gradient, a fade, getting lighter and lighter as I head towards the highlight on the cylinder. Put a little bit of a shadow on the farthest left end of the cylinder so that the highlight is not right up against the edge. That's the shadow wrapping around the back side of the cylinder. Fade that into your highlight, then shade the shadow on the right side of the cylinder all the way to the edge, getting a little bit lighter as you go to create some reflected light on the right side of the cylinder. Add a little dusting of shading to the top left side of the cylinder, and using diagonal lines coming off from the sides of the cylinder and fading from dark to light, create a cast shadow in the direction that the light is pointing. I'll erase those marks I made to indicate the light source so that I have a nice clean page and a beautiful cylinder. There you go. Next up, the cube. Now, drawing the cube is a little bit trickier than drawing a cylinder. It all starts with a diagonal line. Then another diagonal line going the other direction. Then finish off that diamond shape or parallelogram by making sure that the other two lines you draw are parallel with the first two lines you drew. The right side will be parallel with the left, and the top is parallel with the bottom. Then bring down some vertical lines from the top corners of your cube. Make sure they are all the same length. The diagonal lines at the bottom of your cube should be parallel with the lines at the top of your cube. Once you've got your cube drawn, shading on flat surfaces is pretty easy because you don't really have to create many fades. You just have to figure out which side is the dark side. For this cube, since the light is coming from the top left, the darkest side will be on the bottom right. Shade that in darkly and smoothly. The other sides of the cube will be lighter, and it can look weird if the outline around them is very dark, so I'm going to lighten up some of the outlines of my cube before I shade in the other sides. With the light source coming from the top left, the next darkest side of the cube will be on the bottom left. This side of the cube will get some light, so it does not need to be shaded darkly. Shade it with a smooth, medium tone. Like the top of the cylinder, the top of the cube just needs a little dusting of light shading. Then create some light diagonal lines coming from the sides of the cube, and fill it in with faded shading, starting darker and getting lighter as it moves away from the cube. And voila, our first two shaded shapes are done. Let's move on to the final challenge. The first trick to drawing a sphere is to draw a circle. And to get a really nice circle shape, first just practice, draw fake circles, and then gradually let the tip of your pencil touch and go around and around, carving out a nice even circle. Then, using those loose curves, make a nice neat outline around the circle. Then I'll identify where the shadow is. The darkest part of the shadow is going to be in a crescent shape towards the bottom right edge of the sphere. The highlight will be on the top left. Once I've figured out where the shadow and highlights are, I'll start to fill them in with shading. I'm going to shade really dark along that C shape and fade it lighter and lighter towards that circular highlight on the top left. I'm going to keep this shading smooth, and I'm going to keep it wrapping in a C shape. That C will wrap tighter and tighter as you move towards that circular highlight. It will also get lighter and lighter. Once I shade the top half of the cylinder, I'll shade the bottom part, moving from the darkest part of the shadow, getting a little bit lighter, but still staying pretty dark, just allowing a little bit of reflected light to shine back up onto the bottom of that sphere. And then the last thing this sphere needs is a oval-shaped cast shadow on the bottom right side. And there we have a beautiful shaded sphere. Before you start, here's a couple things not to do as you shade. The first thing is don't treat shading like a coloring book. Don't fill in everything with the same darkness of shading. You need to have light and dark areas if you're actually going to show where the highlights and shadows are on your subject. Another thing to keep in mind as you shade is that shading should not be scribbly. It should be nice and smooth. As you shade light and dark areas on your drawing, make sure that the dark areas fade into the light areas and you don't have this striped look. When you shade your sphere, make sure you shade it in a crescent shape, not straight across. If you shade it straight across like this, it will never have the 3D look. And last thing, a little bit of smudging with your fingers can work occasionally, but if you overuse it, you will just smudge your whole drawing and it will all end up looking smudgy and light gray. Not a good look. What we're going for is well-shaded subjects with really dark areas fading smoothly to really light areas across its surface to create a realistic 3D look and the illusion of light hitting your object. And now it's your turn to draw and shade a cylinder, cube, and a sphere.